When Irene Bouchard died on a Wednesday in late November, her daughter and her son-in-law divided what she left behind before the ground had thawed enough to bury her. The house on Chemin des Aubals sold in 11 days. The savings account, just under $22,000 after probate fees and the cost of the headstone, was split at the lawyer's office on a Friday afternoon while the flowers on the kitchen table were still alive. Her son-in-law Raymond kept the truck, a 3-year-old half-ton he'd been borrowing since August anyway. He kept the tools from the shed and sold most of them through a classified listing before Irene's daughter even knew they were gone. What he did not want was the bakery. It sat on the main street of Sainte-Croix-du-Lac like something the town had built around and then forgotten. A narrow 2-story building with a green awning faded to the color of old celery, a hand-lettered sign above the door that read Boulangerie Bouchard in letters her mother had painted herself 38 years ago, and a back kitchen that hadn't produced a single loaf since Irene's hands stopped cooperating with her 2 winters before she died. "It's a burden," Raymond said, setting the keys on the table beside the cardboard box he'd packed for her. "The oven needs replacing. The walk-in's been off since 2021. I had a guy look at it. He said maybe $600 for the equipment if you cleared it out yourself." He pushed the box toward her with 2 fingers. "Your mother's things from the place. Aprons, some old recipe cards. I went through it. Nothing worth keeping." Colette Arseneau, Colette Bouchard, before the marriage that had ended 14 months ago in a courthouse 40 minutes north, picked up the keys. They were cold. The largest one had a strip of green tape on it, worn smooth with Avant written in her mother's careful hand. "That's it," she said. "That's it." She looked around the kitchen of the house where she'd grown up, half-emptied already belonging to someone she hadn't met. "I guess that's it," she said. The bakery had been closed for 2 years by the time Colette drove down to it on a gray Thursday morning in February. She had $63 in her checking account. She had a stand mixer still in its box in the back of her car, a wedding gift she'd never unwrapped because the marriage had not turned out to be the kind that needed a stand mixer. She had a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on Saint Laurent in Montreal, 3 hours north, where the landlord had started leaving voicemails. She returned every other call and promised a little more time. The salvage company in town opened at 8:30. If she could empty the place by then, she could let them take the equipment and the fixtures and maybe clear enough to cover February. She parked on the street in front and sat in the car for longer than she meant to. Then she got out, because there was nothing else to do. The key stuck, the way it always had, and then the door opened, and the smell reached her before her eyes adjusted to the dark. Butter worked deep into the walls. Brown sugar, the particular sweetness of a kitchen that has baked 10,000 mornings, and holds them all in its wood and its plaster. And underneath it something that was simply her mother, the way a person's presence lingers in a place long after the person is gone, as though the building itself has been paying attention. Colette stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and did not move. The front room was exactly as Irene had left it. 4 small tables with mismatched chairs, a long glass display case empty now, its light off, a chalkboard on the wall beside the register, and on it, in her mother's round, careful letters, the last thing she'd ever written there: "Today. Sourdough, maple walnut, and what you came for." Colette stared at the last 4 words for a long time before she admitted she didn't understand them. What you came for was not a menu item. It was something else entirely, and she had no idea what. She walked the length of the room. She ran her hand along the display case, feeling the glass cool and slightly grimy under her palm. She pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. It was cleaner than it had any right to be. The counters wiped down, the big Hobart mixer covered with a cloth. Someone had been in this kitchen, not casually, and her mother had been dead for 6 weeks. That was the first thing that didn't fit. In the corner of the front room, set slightly apart from the others, was a table her mother had called the window table, though 2 of the 4 tables faced the window. The chair nearest the glass was different from the others, a low armchair, upholstered in a dark green fabric worn pale at the armrests. It looked like something brought from home, not bought for a bakery. On the wall beside it hung a photograph Colette had never seen. Her mother as a young woman, maybe 30, flower on her apron, standing at the open front door of the bakery the morning it opened. The awning behind her was bright green, the sign new. She was laughing at something off camera, her head turned, her eyes bright. Colette could not remember the last time she had seen her mother laugh like that. She sat down in the armchair because her legs had stopped wanting to hold her up. Through the front window she could see Saint Croix du Lac in the gray February morning. Across the street, the lights were on in the hardware store. Quincaillerie Thibault, the sign read, in the same font it had used since before Colette was born. Someone over there was already moving around, already at work. The way someone is always at work in towns like this while the rest of the world is still finding its footing. Colette rested her palms flat on the table, 44 years old. A marriage ended by a man who had decided, with quiet administrative efficiency, that she was a season he was finished with. A catering business she'd shuttered 8 months before because she could not keep her hands steady enough to present food to strangers. A mother in the ground she had been meaning to visit more often since her father died, and had not, because meaning to is the most comfortable distance between a person and what they know they should do. She had come here to empty the place and walk away. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had done that already, in a parking lot in October, alone, and what she felt now was something past grief. The particular stillness of a woman who has used up the energy it takes to feel things and is waiting for it to come back. Then she got up, because the salvage company opened at 8:30, and she went to the back. The storage room off the kitchen was narrow, shelved on both sides, mostly bare. A few industrial tins of maple extract, a 10-kilogram bag of almond flour gone dense as clay. Colette began pulling things off the shelves and stacking them by the door. She had cleared the bottom shelf on the left when her knee came down on a seam in the floor she hadn't noticed. She looked down. The storage room floor was wide plank pine, original to the building, except for one section near the back wall, about half a meter square. The boards there were newer, the grain running a slightly different direction, the gap between them tighter. A person moving quickly would never catch it. Colette had spent 20 years in professional kitchens. She knew what a floor was supposed to look like. She knelt. Her fingers found a recessed pull along the baseboard, painted to disappear. She worked it with her thumbnail. It held. Then it gave with a soft metallic knock, and a panel lifted on a hidden hinge to reveal a shallow space cut into the subfloor, lined with a piece of old wool blanket, folded double so nothing inside would shift. The things inside had not been hidden carelessly. They had been placed there the way a person places what matters most. Colette lifted them out one at a time and set them on the storage room floor. 3 notebooks, the kind with the black and white marbled covers, their spines soft from years of opening. A tin, an old shortbread tin, the Scottish kind with a tartan lid, its lid pressed on tight, heavier than it should be. A bundle of envelopes, maybe 40, bound with a length of kitchen twine gone slightly stiff. A small blue bankbook stamped Caisse Populaire de Saint Croix, its cover faded at the corners. A brown envelope, thick, sealed, with the name of a law office printed in the top left corner. And underneath, lying flat, a plain white envelope with one word written across it in blue rollerball ink. In a hand Colette had known her whole life and had called less often than she should have. Colette. She sat back on her heels. Around her, the storage room was cold and dim and smelled of her mother. Outside, a delivery truck downshifted on the main street and was gone, and the silence came back, and in it she could hear her own breathing. If you followed Colette this far into that back room, stay with us. Because everything her mother sealed under those floorboards is about to come into the light, and none of it is what her daughter was expecting. She opened the bank book first, because it was the thing she recognized. The account was in Irene Bouchard's name. The first deposit was dated 32 years ago, $3. After that, the entries ran down the page and on to the next, a deposit nearly every week for 3 decades, never large, $1 sometimes, 5, occasionally 10. The final entry was made 11 days before Irene died, and the balance beside it read $41,214. Colette read the number 3 times. Her mother had run a bakery where a loaf of sourdough cost $6.50 and a butter tart was $1.75. She had never spoken of savings beyond the account Raymond had already emptied. This one had never been mentioned. Built a few dollars at a time, week after week for 32 years, the way you fill a jar with spare change without ever counting it until one day the jar is too heavy to lift. She opened the shortbread tin. It was full of folded bills, 5s and 10s mostly, soft from handling, and on top of them a slip of paper in her mother's handwriting. For the chair, so the next one has somewhere to sit. Colette did not yet know what the chair meant. She set the tin down carefully. She opened the brown envelope. Inside was a deed. The building she was sitting in, lot and structure at the corner of Rue Principale and Chemin de la Gare, purchased outright 17 years ago for $31,000 cash. The buyer's name? Irene Marie Bouchard. Colette frowned at it. She had always assumed her mother rented the bakery, that it belonged to some landlord in town, the way it had when Colette was a girl. She had assumed this for her entire adult life and had never once asked, because the question had never seemed important enough to interrupt a phone call she was already trying to end. Clipped to the deed was a second sheet, a narrow lot adjacent to the building, purchased the same day, and a note in Irene's hand. In trust. C. Trépanier de Chêne. Colette had never heard of Trépanier de Chêne. She picked up the white envelope and turned it over. The back was blank. She slid her thumb under the flap and pulled out 4 pages, folded in thirds, the writing even at the top and looser near the end, the way her mother's handwriting always got, when her hands were tired. Dear Colette, it began. If you found the floor, then I'm gone and you're sitting in my storage room in the cold wondering what your mother was up to. That's fair. I should have told you. I tried to find a way in more than once, but every time I started talking it came out sounding like I wanted a medal. And the whole point was that this was never about that. So I wrote it down instead and put it somewhere that only someone willing to do the work of clearing out the place would find. If you're reading this, you did the work. You always did the work. You just forgot that for a while. So did I. Colette stopped. She read the next paragraph and her chest pulled tight. You've probably noticed the kitchen is too clean for a place that's been empty 2 years. That's Marguerite, from the church, 2 streets over. She's kept the pipes from freezing every winter since my hands stopped being reliable. There's an armchair in the front room by the window. I want you to leave it there. I'll explain in a moment. She turned to the marbled notebooks then, because she had to. She opened the first one to the middle, and her mother's round handwriting filled the page in dated entries. February 7. Woman came in just before close, maybe 50. Coat too thin for the weather, asked for the end-of-day discount on anything left. Gave her the full loaves, the remaining tarts, a bag of rolls. Wouldn't take money for the chair. She sat an hour before she could go back out. Said she was between places. I told her the chair was for sitting in and she didn't have to explain herself further. She turned the page. March 22. The Pelletier boy, 17 or 18, walked in at the end of the afternoon with nothing on him. Hungry. Wouldn't say so. I put a bowl of soup in front of him and a sandwich and called it the tasting menu, and he ate everything without looking up. Tucked $20 into the paper bag when I sent him home. He came back the next Tuesday and every Tuesday after that for 2 years until he left for Chicoutimi for school. Never mentioned the money. I didn't either. Proud as just hurt that's still standing. Colette turned forward, then back, then forward again. Hundreds of entries, each one a person. Each one a date, a small fact. A quiet act performed without announcement, after the other customers had gone and her mother had told no one. Not her husband when he was alive. Not the regulars who came every morning. Not her own daughter who had grown up folding bakery boxes at that very counter and thought she knew what the place was. She went back to the letter. The chair by the window is for a woman named Denise Lalonde who I've never stopped thinking about. My second winter, here a woman knocked on the door 10 minutes after close. January. Cold enough to crack pavement. She'd walked from the bus stop on the highway because the shelter in town was full, and she needed somewhere warm to sit until the next bus came at 9. I told her through the glass I was closed. Sorry. Come back tomorrow. She nodded the way people nod when they've heard that before and walked back out into the dark. I don't know what happened to her. I looked, later, after I could breathe again, and I couldn't find anything. Just a woman who needed 10 minutes of warmth and a door that didn't open. I have never let that armchair sit empty and cold since. Anyone who comes in during the last hour of the day looking like they need somewhere to be. They get the chair and whatever's left of the afternoon's baking, and I don't ask them a single question they don't want to answer. That's all it ever was. A warm place and something to eat, so the sex Denise doesn't walk back out into the cold because I was too tired. Colette set the pages down in her lap. She was crying. The way she had not let herself cry in months. The way that comes up from somewhere kept sealed, and she did not try to stop it. The bakery was cold around her and it smelled of butter and her mother and 38 years of early mornings. And she sat on the floor of the room where her mother had hidden the whole truth of herself and she read the rest. The handwriting of a woman she had thought she knew. A woman who got up at 4 in the morning and came home with flour in her hair and fell asleep before the 9 o'clock news. A woman Colette had never once thought to ask what tired her out. The salvage company opened at 8:30. By 8:55, Colette was still on the storage room floor, surrounded by 32 years of her mother's secret accounting, reading the names of people she would spend a long time learning. She did not call the salvage company. She sat in the building Raymond had called a burden, and for the first time since the divorce, she felt something other than the long flat. Nothing she had been telling herself was fine. The fourth notebook, the oldest, its cover gone soft as fabric, began 40 years ago, a year before Colette was born. October 3 kept the chair out tonight for the first time. Nobody came. But the lights on and the door was unlocked an extra hour, and that felt right. Mayman would say I'm being foolish, maybe, but I keep thinking about Denise. She kept reading, page after page, and the town her mother described was a town Colette had grown up in and never seen. An elderly man who came every Thursday and paid for one coffee and sat 3 hours because the alternative was an apartment where no one spoke to him. Her mother had kept his cup full and charged him for one. A young couple the winter after the mill layoffs, who came in for a single butter tart to split between them and sat looking at the table in a way that told her everything. She fed them soup and sandwiches and sent them home with a box of day-olds and told them the shelf life was very short and she'd only be throwing it out otherwise. A teenage girl who came in most Fridays for 2 years and sat in the chair by the window reading, not buying anything, and her mother had understood without being told that home was not a place this girl wanted to be on Friday afternoons. And so the chair was hers, and the warmth was hers, and a small plate of something always appeared beside her without a word about money. Each entry the same shape, the date, the person, what they needed, what her mother did. No record of what was owed, no record of anything being owed. She kept books not to collect, but so that someone would know the people had been real. Colette picked up the bundle of letters. The twine crumbled when she touched it, and the envelope scattered, and she picked up the nearest one. Lined paper, folded small, the writing slow and deliberate. Dear Irene, I don't know if you'll remember me. Winter, maybe 15 years ago, I came in with my 2 kids and no money, and you gave us lunch and told me the soup was about to be tossed anyway. It wasn't, I could tell. My kids are teenagers now. My daughter wants to be a pastry chef. I tell her about the bakery lady who never made us feel like charity cases. Thank you for that, some kindnesses you carry for a long time. The next was printed from a computer, the email address still visible at the top. Ms. Bouchard, you probably don't remember me. I came through St. Croix 11 years ago in very bad shape, stopped at your bakery because I saw the lights on, and I was so tired I couldn't think straight, and I needed to sit somewhere that felt human. You gave me tea and a croissant, and you talked to me about the weather and a CBC show you'd been watching, and you never once asked me what was wrong. I stayed 2 hours. When I left, I felt like a person again instead of a problem. I'm writing to tell you I'm still here. That matters more than I can say. Another, handwritten on the back of a school fundraiser flyer, 3 lines only. You let my father sit in that chair every Tuesday for a year and a half after my mother passed. He said it was the only place he didn't feel like a ghost. Thank you, from all of us, and one in a child's large careful printing, with a drawing below it of a building with a green roof and a yellow square in the window. Madame Irene, your bread made my dad cry, but in a good way. He said it tasted like before. Thank you. Colette read 9 letters and then she had to stop. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the February light coming gray and thin through the small window above the shelves, and she thought about Denise Lalonde, whose last name she had only just learned, walking back out into a January night because a door hadn't opened. She found the paragraph in her mother's letter that she kept returning to. The building is mine, Colette, has been for 17 years. I paid cash the week I had enough saved that no landlord could lock this door for someone else's reasons. I put it in a trust so that after I'm gone, it stays what it is. Your ex-husband is a practical man. He'll want to sell it. He'll have good arguments. He'll say I wasn't thinking clearly toward the end, and that may even be what he believes. But I was thinking more clearly than I ever had. The money in the bank and the money in the tin are for one thing only: keeping the chair warm and the oven on for the next person who needs it. I'm asking you to keep it going. I know your marriage broke. I know you closed the catering business. You didn't tell me, not directly, but I could hear it in your voice the way I could always hear the things you were trying not to say. I want you to know that none of that is the story of who you are. You are the girl who stood on a step stool at 4 years old and learned to fold a croissant. You are the best baker I ever knew. And I should have said that while I could say it out loud. Keep the chair by the window. That's the only thing I figured out that was worth passing on. She folded the pages and held them against her chest. Through the front window, the lights across the street at Quincaillerie-Thibault went off, and a moment later the door opened and a man came out in a canvas jacket, looking at Colette's car, and then at the dark window of the bakery. He walked across the street with the careful step of someone whose knees are no longer enthusiastic about stairs. And he reached the bakery door, and he looked in through the glass and saw her sitting on the floor of the storage room with a notebook spread around her, and his face shifted. He let himself in. He had a key. The little bell above the door, which Colette had not noticed until now, gave one clean note. "Your Colette," he said. "Not a question. Irene's daughter. You've got her forehead when she was concentrating. How did you know her?" The man stopped a few steps inside and looked at the notebooks on the floor, then at the open panel in the storage room, and let out a long breath. "Resemblance, hardware store across the street. Your mother and I went back 30 years. He looked at the floor, at the lifted panel, and shook his head slowly. "You found it. You knew I knew some. Nobody knew all of it but Irene." He brought a chair in from the front room, turned it around, and sat with his arms crossed on the back. "Your mother pulled my daughter out of an eating disorder," he said. "That's the first thing you should know before anything else. 15 years ago. My girl was 16 and I didn't know what was happening, only that she'd stopped eating. And one afternoon I looked across the street and she was in that chair by your mother's window with a plate of bread and butter in front of her. And Irene was sitting across from her, doing nothing at all, just being present. That went on most Thursdays for almost 2 years. Irene never told me what they talked about. My daughter's 31 now. She's got 2 kids of her own and she eats everything in sight. And she cried for 3 days when she heard about your mother. So, that's the first thing." Colette looked at him. "Tell me," she said, "all of it." So he did. He told her how the chair by the window had been Irene's signal to the people who knew, that the last hour before close was different from the rest of the day. No rush, no judgment, no running total. He told her about the tin and how certain regulars, the ones who'd figured out what was happening, would drop bills into it when they thought Irene wasn't looking. He told her how Irene had a relationship with the women at the church, 2 streets over, who sent her people in the winter who needed something warm, and how she'd taken in women fleeing hard situations and let them sit in the bakery until the shelter had a bed, because a bakery in the middle of the day looked like nothing, and nothing was sometimes the safest thing. He told her about the last 2 winters, when Irene's hands had gotten too unreliable for the ovens, but she still came in every day, that she'd sit in the window chair herself then, on the days when no one needed it, reading and watching the street, that even closed the building still felt open to the people who knew it. She told me once, Réjean said, that the hardest part wasn't the giving. It was the watching them leave. She'd feed someone who'd come in the door with nothing, and she'd watch their car pull away and spend the rest of the day wondering if they'd be all right, because she was the last stop before the highway going north. After here, there wasn't another town for 60 kilometers. Colette closed the notebook in her lap. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She pulled it out. "Raymond." "Hey," he said. He had the careful tone of a man who had decided to be reasonable. "I got some forwarded mail today from your mother's estate file. Tax notice on a commercial property, on Principale. It's listed under her name. I didn't see this in the estate disclosure. It's the bakery, right? That's the thing. If she was holding property that wasn't disclosed, that could affect what was split. The estate wasn't finalized with this on record. You already divided everything, Raymond. I divided what I knew about. If there were hidden assets, it's in a trust." A pause. "What kind of trust? The kind that says what it's for?" "Colette." His voice shifted into the register she recognized from the end of their marriage, the one that meant he had already decided and was now explaining. "Toward the end, your mother wasn't always clear. The fact that she was hiding accounts and buying buildings without telling anyone, that's not the action of someone thinking straight. We need a lawyer to look at this before you make any decisions. She bought that buildings 17 years ago. Her handwriting in that deed is the same as the handwriting in the birthday card she sent me last March. I'm just saying. You took the truck the week she died," Colette said. Her voice was level. It was a voice she had not used in over a year, the voice she used in a busy kitchen when things were going sideways and someone needed to stop talking and start thinking. "You cleared the bank account. You sold the contents of the shed to a man from Craigslist before she was in the ground. You handed me a building you called a burden and a box of aprons, and now there's real property on the table, and suddenly you're concerned about her mental state. Silence. I'm calling the lawyers, Raymond said. Trépanier Deschênes, if that's who she used. That's exactly who she used, Colette said. Go ahead. She hung up. Her hand was steady. She sat in her mother's bakery with her mother's letter in her lap, and Réjean Thibault watched her from across the room with an expression that took her a moment to place. It was the look of someone who has been waiting a long time to see the right person show up. He picked right, Réjean said quietly. She picked right. If you're still with Colette, do us a favor and subscribe. Because what happened when Raymond's lawyers showed up is the part of this story we've been waiting to tell you. Colette did not drive back to Montreal that night. She slept in the small apartment above the bakery, the one she hadn't known existed until Réjean showed her the narrow door beside the walk-in, a single bed with a quilted cover, a shelf of paperbacks, a lamp in the window that he had been leaving on since November because, he said, he couldn't stand to see the building go dark. She lay awake listening to the main street settle into the cold, and she thought about Denise Lalonde. In the morning, Réjean brought coffee from the hardware store and a woman she didn't know. Marguerite Cotte was past 65, small and precise, with silver hair cut close, and the posture of someone who had spent decades in charge of something. She had handled Irene's banking for the last 3 years through the Caisse Populaire, and had also quietly been the person keeping the bakery's water from freezing over 2 winters. When she walked through the door, she stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the chalkboard and pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. Then she crossed the floor and took both of Colette's hands in hers and looked at her directly. I knew you when you were 3 years old, sitting on the counter, stealing raisins out of the cinnamon buns before they went in the case, she said. You've got your mother's hands and your grandmother's stubbornness and your father's exact frown. She talked about you more than you know. You knew, Colette said. About all of it. I knew everything. Marguerite sat down in the window chair without ceremony, the way someone sits in a place they have sat 1,000 times. I handled the trust documentation with the lawyers. I knew every deposit. I kept her books for the last 6 years when her eyes started going. She looked out the window at the February street. Your mother had a gift I have never seen in anyone else in 50 years of community work. She could make a person feel like the help wasn't help at all. Like they were just a customer who happened to be having a bad year. Like the food appeared by accident and the warmth was just something the building did on its own. She was almost offended if you called it charity. She'd say, people don't come to a bakery for charity. They come for bread. I just make a lot of bread. She stood after a moment and moved to the corkboard. Colette hadn't looked at closely yet beside the register. It was covered in photographs, layered over years. The town at various Christmases, a flooding spring, a long Ago summer fair. Irene in almost all of them, always at the edge, always half-turned, always doing something. She's in the background of every photograph anyone ever took in here, Marguerite said. 38 years. I don't think she's looking at the camera in a single one. She was always in the middle of something that needed doing. She touched a photograph near the top, a full room, a winter morning. Irene behind the counter, head bent over the display case. Some people spend their lives making sure people know what they did, Marguerite said. Your mother spent hers making sure no one did. She thought that the moment a kindness had a name on it, it stopped being one. It became something else, something that needed thanking, and she couldn't stand the thanking. It embarrassed her. She paused. It's rarer than you'd think. Most of us can't help wanting to be seen. People came that day. Word had moved through Sainte Croix du Lac the way it moves in small towns, which is faster than any technology and with better detail. The woman whose daughter had sat in the chair on Thursdays for 2 years came first, Réjean's daughter, whose name was Amélie, who was 31 and had driven 4 hours from Quebec City when she heard that Irene's daughter was at the bakery. She walked in and looked at the window chair and stood still for a long moment before she could speak. I never told her what those Thursdays meant, she said. I kept thinking I'd write a letter. She looked at Colette. There's a letter in that bundle, I think. I sent it maybe 6 years ago. I couldn't make myself sign it. I didn't know how to explain where I'd been. Colette thought of the unsigned letter in the bundle, the one that said I felt like a person again instead of a problem, and said nothing. But she reached across and took Amélie's hand for a moment, and Amélie understood. After her came an older man, a retired postal worker named Gaston, who said Irene had let him sit in the bakery every Thursday morning for 3 years after his wife died. Not the window chair, just a regular table, and she'd kept his coffee cup full and never charged him past the first one, and he'd had a reason to get dressed and leave the house twice a week, and that had kept him, he said plainly, from a very dark place. After him, a woman in her 40s named Sandrine, who said that 12 years ago she had walked into the bakery one afternoon in January with nowhere to be, and Irene had taken one look at her and locked the front door and sat down across from her with 2 cups of tea, and kept her there until a bed opened at the women's shelter in St. Gilles. She didn't ask me anything I didn't want to answer, Sandrine said. She just didn't open the door. A man Colette's age came in the afternoon, sat down at a table, and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. He said he had driven through 11 years ago, meaning to keep driving north, to a place he'd picked on a map. And the only reason he hadn't was that he'd seen the light in the bakery window, and he was so hungry he could barely see straight, and he'd gone in. And Irene had fed him and talked to him about an ice storm the previous winter, and a book she was reading, and the problem with pre-sliced bread, and somewhere in 2 hours of complete mundanity, the thing that had been pressing on him from inside had eased enough that he'd driven south instead. He had a daughter now, a house in Drummondville. He'd sent a letter years ago that he'd never signed. She didn't know, he said, what she did. She just kept the light on and made sure there was food. She knew, Marguerite said from the window chair. She always knew. She just never let on. That evening, the letter from Raymond's lawyer arrived by email. It challenged the validity of the trust on grounds of cognitive impairment, citing the hidden accounts, the undisclosed property, the pattern of secretive financial behavior, as evidence that Irene Bouchard had not been of sound mind at the time of the trust's creation. Colette read it standing at the counter. Then Réjean called, and she read him the relevant paragraph, and he was quiet for a moment. "I'll be right over," he said. He came with a cardboard box. Inside, 17 years of service records from the bakery's HVAC and electrical systems, everyone requested by Irene in writing, everyone signed in her hand. A copy of the trust documents from Trépanier Deschênes, drafted in detail and reviewed annually, and the name of the doctor who had assessed Irene's capacity at the trust's last review, 8 months before her death. "He can say she was hiding things," Réjean said. "She was. From the people who'd have told her she was foolish. That's different from not knowing what she was doing. Those are the clearest documents I've ever read." I watched her sign the last revision in September. She had her reading glasses on and her own pen, and she read every line. Marguerite, who had come over when Réjean called her, said, "And I have 30 years of bank records showing consistent, purposeful, structured deposits that do not indicate anything except a woman who knew exactly what she was building." "When's the hearing?" Réjean asked. "They're requesting a review in 3 weeks. Then we'll be there." They were. The hearing was held on a Tuesday in the county courthouse in Joliet. Colette sat at the left table with the lawyer from Trépanier Deschênes, a woman named Adese Okonkwo, who had driven from Montreal, and who had the particular calm of someone who has read this story before and knows how it ends. Raymond sat at the right table with his own lawyer, and Renée, his new partner, who kept her coat on. When Colette turned around, the rows behind her were full. Marguerite, Réjean, Amélie, Gaston the retired postal worker, Sandrine, the man from Drummondville who had driven 2.5 hours with his daughter, age 7, who fell asleep in his lap halfway through. 2 women from the church social committee. The woman from the letter about the soup that tasted like before, who had found out about the hearing through someone who'd heard from someone and had driven down from Septiles, and others Colette had not met that week, who had heard what was happening and come because they wanted to be in the room when someone tried to call Irene Bouchard confused. Raymond's lawyer made his argument: secrecy, undisclosed assets, a pattern of financial concealment inconsistent with a person in full possession of her faculties. Adese answered, with the medical records, the trust documentation, the service records in Réjean's box. She answered with the precise language of a woman who had helped Irene draft those documents, and knew which paragraphs had been Irene's own words, and which had been suggested and revised. And then she did something the law did not require but the judge allowed. She let the room speak. Gaston stood first. He said that for 3 years he had sat across from Irene Bard twice a week, and that she had remembered without fail the name of his wife, the names of his children, the name of the street he'd grown up on, the name of the novel he'd been trying to read since his wife died. There was nothing wrong with her mind, he said simply. She just paid attention. Amélie stood and her voice was steady. She said that for 2 years, every Thursday she had sat in that chair by the window, and that Irene had never once pushed or prodded or tried to fix anything, had only been present, which was the thing Amélie had needed most and not known how to ask for, and that a woman without full cognitive capacity does not provide that kind of sustained, calibrated, patient presence for 2 years. She knew exactly what she was doing, Amélie said. She just made sure you never felt like a project. The man from Drummondville stood, holding his sleeping daughter. He did not say what had brought him to that bakery 11 years ago. He said only, "I'm here, that's because of her, and she did it without knowing my name." Sandrine stood and said, "She didn't open the door until she knew I had somewhere to go." That's not confusion, that's judgment. One after another. Raymond sat through all of it, and he didn't look at his lawyer or at Renee. And once or twice Colette saw him look at the people who were standing up to describe a woman he had managed her mother's estate without once asking to know. The judge dismissed the challenge in under an hour. The trust was valid. Colette was the sole trustee. The matter was closed. Raymond's lawyer collected his files. Renee was already moving. Raymond stood and walked toward the back of the room and had to pass the whole row of people who had come for Irene. He didn't stop, but when he came even with Colette's row, his pace slowed and he looked at her and his jaw was set, and underneath the set of it she saw something she had not seen on his face in the last year of their marriage. Something cracking. Then he pushed through the door and he was gone. Spring came early that year. The snow off the main street by the second week of March, the green awning replaced by April, the brick scrubbed down, and the windows cleaned until the morning light came through without obstruction. Réjean's nephew did the oven. A new Bongard deck oven, second-hand from a place in Laval that had upgraded, but in good repair and capable of baking 30 loaves at once. Réjean's nephew also rewired the display case lighting and replaced the walk-in compressor. And he did it at cost because his uncle asked him to, and because his uncle had explained what the bakery was. Marguerite came 3 mornings a week to handle the till and the books, the way she had for Irene at the end. She brought with her a folded sheet of paper with Irene's standard recipes, the ones she'd memorized from a decade of watching. Sourdough, maple walnut, the cinnamon buns with the raisins, the butter tarts, the tourtière for holidays. Colette baked. That was the thing. That was all she did for 3 weeks before the reopening, just baked. She broke the oven in with loaf after loaf, adjusting the temperature, learning its particular timing, letting her hands remember what her head had been telling her for 14 months it had forgotten. She found, scratched into the underside of the prep table in the back kitchen in small careful letters her mother must have made in the first year with the building. IB, 1987. And beside it, in a clumsy child's gouge she had no memory of making but recognized immediately as her own, a crooked C. She knelt with her thumb in that letter for a long time. Then she went back to the baking. Late one night, in the 3rd week, she read the last notebook, the oldest one, and near the back, in ink that had gone slightly darker than the surrounding pages, she found herself. The entry was dated 14 months ago. Colette called tonight. She sounded like someone standing in a house after the ceiling has come down. She didn't tell me about the business, not directly. She never says the hard things directly. She circles them the way you circle a thing on the floor. You're not sure you should pick up. But I could hear it. The way I could always hear the things she was folding small and putting away. She blames herself. I know that sound. I made it myself, the winter I let Denise Lalonde walk back out into the cold. She thinks she failed at the only thing she loved. She thinks that says something permanent about her. It doesn't. A business failing isn't a verdict on a person. It's a Tuesday that kept going in the wrong direction. But she won't let me say that. She's proud the way her father was proud, quietly and to her own disadvantage. She'll come back here after I've always known that. She'll find what I've been doing and she'll understand. Maybe why you keep a light on even when you're not sure anyone out there is looking for it. And maybe she'll keep it on after me. I never could tell her I was proud of her without it coming out wrong. The words would get tangled up in the things we hadn't said, and she'd hear criticism instead of what I meant. And I'd let it go because I didn't know how to unknot it. So I'm writing it here instead. I am proud of her. I have always been proud of her. She is the best baker I have ever known, and she learned it in this kitchen, and she carried it further than I ever did, and the fact that it hurt her on the way doesn't change what it is. I'm sorry I didn't find a way to say it out loud while I still had the voice. Colette pressed her hands flat on the counter and held them there, the way her mother used to hold her own hands down when she was working something out. She had called her mother that night. She had spent 20 minutes talking about nothing, circling the collapse of everything she had built. And her mother had heard every word of what she hadn't said and had written it, down in a book and put it under the floor, in a room her daughter would only enter if she showed up to do the work. She sat at her mother's counter, under her mother's last chalkboard, and let the full weight of that land on her. And when it was done, she felt the way a surface feels when you've finally taken it back down to the original wood. The reopening was a Tuesday in late April, early enough that the morning came in cold and bright. The sky the particular blue that only appears in Quebec in spring after a long winter, a blue that looks like it's been waiting. Réjean arrived before 7 to check the water lines one last time. Marguerite came with a clean apron and a disagreement about the cinnamon to sugar ratio in the buns that was never going to be resolved. Amélie had driven up from Quebec City the night before and was already inside rearranging the tables with the confident authority of someone who has decided she belongs somewhere. By 9, there were people in the room. Most of them hadn't come for bread. They'd come because the place existed again, and they wanted to be there when it did. Gaston at his usual table, his coffee already in front of him. Sandrine, standing by the window. The man from Drummondville, this time without his daughter but with his wife, who had never been to Sainte Croix but had heard enough about a bakery and a lit window that she'd asked to come. Colette stood behind the counter in her mother's apron, which had been hanging on its hook by the kitchen door, which fit, and she looked out at the room, and something that had been seized in her chest since the divorce and the catering business, and the long Montreal winter released. Then Raymond walked in. No René. No lawyer. He stood in the doorway in a jacket she hadn't seen before, and he looked at the room, and at the chair by the window, and at the chalkboard where Colette had written her mother's words back in her own hand that morning. Today. Sourdough. Maple walnut and what you came for. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when they are paying attention. Colette came around the counter. "Can we talk?" Raymond said. She walked past him to the front door and he followed, and they stood on the pavement outside in the April sun, the new green awning overhead, the sign Réjean had repainted in the same letters her mother had used. "I sat in that room," Raymond said. He was looking at the building. "I listened to all of them, every single one." His voice had the quality of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had finally been released. "About halfway through, I realized something I should have understood 30 years ago, which is that I met your mother maybe twice a year for 12 years, and thought that meant I knew her. I knew a woman who made good bread and asked after people's children. I didn't know anything." He stopped. "I didn't ask. It didn't occur to me there was anything to ask." Colette waited. She had learned this from the notebooks. "You let people arrive." "I had a call from a relocation company last week," Raymond said. "They're expanding into the region, looking for properties on Principale for a chain location. They offered $280,000 for this building." He reached into his jacket. "My share of the house after costs was $26,000. I'm giving you half. $13,000, made out to the trust." He held out an envelope. She took it. "It's not enough," he said. "For 12 years of not asking." "I know that." "No," she said, "but it's a start." He nodded. He did not try to say more, and she didn't reach for anything further, and that was all right. He had come and said the real thing, which was harder than it looked. He walked to his car and pulled out onto Principale and turned toward the highway, and Colette did not wonder whether he was going to be okay. She went back inside. The dining room had found its rhythm. Marguerite was refilling Gaston's cup and losing the cinnamon argument gracefully. Amélie was showing Réjean something on her phone that was making him laugh. The morning light came in clean through the new windows and fell across the counter in a long stripe of gold. The bell above the door rang. Colette turned. A woman came in, maybe 30, in a winter coat too heavy for April, carrying a child on her hip, a girl, maybe 3, with her cheek pressed into her mother's shoulder. The woman had the wide, careful eyes of someone who hasn't slept enough for a long time and is trying not to let that show. "Someone at the gas station on the highway told me about this place," the woman said. "She said you don't. She said it doesn't matter if you have money. She said there's a chair and you don't ask questions." "There is," Colette said. "Come in, the chair's by the window, it gets the best light." She brought them over. The little girl looked at the empty display case and then at Colette with the frank assessment of a 3-year-old deciding whether someone is trustworthy. "How long since she's eaten?" Colette asked quietly. "Last night. I have some cash I can. You don't need it here. That's not what this place is. You just have to need something, and everyone needs something sometimes." She went into the kitchen. Her mother's kitchen. Her kitchen now. She washed her hands at the sink, which was her mother's habit and her grandmother's before that. She took down a pan. She set it on the oven. She was still learning. And for the first time in 14 months she cooked a meal for someone who couldn't pay for it. And her hands, which had been uncertain for over a year, were not uncertain at all. She made the girl a grilled cheese, cut diagonally the way her mother had always cut them, the way her grandmother had cut them before that. She made the mother an omelet with herbs, toast, coffee. She carried the plates out herself and set them down without a word about prices or gratitude. She watched the woman's shoulders drop 2 full inches at the simple fact of food placed in front of her without a transaction attached. "Thank you," the woman said, and her eyes filled. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did the right thing," Colette said. "Eat, and if you need to stay past close, the chair is yours. We don't put anyone back out on that highway in the dark." Late that afternoon, when the lunch rush had come and gone, and Marguerite had gone home and Amélie had driven back toward the highway with the bag of bread for the road, Colette stood alone behind the counter and watched the light change on Rue Principale, the shadows going long, the sky going the deep clear blue it becomes in April before the cold comes back overnight. She went into the storage room. She lifted the panel in the floor and looked into the empty space her mother had lined with old wool and filled with the whole hidden truth of herself. The notebooks were on the shelf behind the register now, where anyone could read them. The letters were framed on the wall beside the corkboard. The deed was filed with the trust, the bank book at the case, the tin back on the shelf by the register with her mother's note still inside it, for the chair. So the next one has somewhere to sit. Everything Irene had sealed in the dark was in the light now, turned into a roof and an oven and a chair by the window, and a sign that said, quietly, that the door was open. Colette closed the panel. She walked to the front of the bakery as the day let go, and she reached up and turned on the lamp in the window. The same lamp Réjean had refused to let go dark since November, the same lamp her mother had kept burning in that window for 38 years. Because somewhere out on the highway tonight, or tomorrow night, someone was going to come around the bend into Saint-Croix-du-Lac running out of road. And they were going to see a narrow building on the main street with a green awning and a square of warm light in the window, and they were going to know what her mother had spent a lifetime making sure they would know. That someone was awake, that the door would open, that they would be fed, and no one would ask them anything they didn't want to answer. Colette left the light on. There was bread to make in the morning, and the morning after, and every morning after that, and her hands were ready.